The celestial mandala of service accompanies you to discover the 8th constellation of the wheel of the zodiac that we call Scorpio, associated with the field of service and healing in the new era. Welcome to this 8th episode of this cycle of podcasts dedicated to human service fields. And this month, in the sign of Scorpio, we will be focusing on the field of healing and how we might imagine health and healing in the new era of human life. My name is Lorraine Flower, and I'm a member of the Community of Living Ethics and your host for this podcast today. Scorpio is a water sign of purification and healing. It emanates energy of harmony through conflict, which activates the creative dynamics of opposites to achieve harmonic synthesis. I think most people know it's a challenging sign because it invites us to confront the shadow side of life and to heal it as the pathway to peace and harmony. The human condition has as its core the essence of Scorpio, the need to transmute and transform all tensions and conflicts, emotional, mental, physical, and spiritual, within us and across humanity. Only in this way can we arrive at true health on all levels. So as we explore the topic of health and healing for the new era, we're invited to consider the many different levels of healing and reconciliation needed to arrive at true health. Conflicts such as wars, tensions within families, negative beliefs and prejudice all contribute to dis-ease and lack of health on an individual as well as a global level. To help us reflect on this vast subject of health and healing, I'd like to welcome our guest today, Tim Ewer. Dr. Tim Ewer has been working in integrative medicine for over 30 years, and he's vocationally registered as both a specialist physician and a general practitioner. He's been an advisor to the World Health Organization on natural medicine, as well as to the New Zealand government. He's Vice President of the Australasian Integrative Medicine Association and a faculty member of the Australian College of Nutrition and Environmental Medicine. Welcome, Tim. We're really delighted that you could join us today for this subject of healing, a vast subject. And as I said earlier, today we're going to reflect on a new future, a future perhaps where health and healing will be far more consciously and deeply understood as a principle and practice across humanity, and one that might actually be a really important stepping stone to living the truth and beauty of our world. And if I may get underway with a first question, would you be willing to start by offering us a general overview of your philosophy and your perspective on health and healing?
Yes, well, thank you, Lorraine, for this opportunity. I much appreciate it. So probably to try and give my overview, the best place would be just to give a short idea of my own journey, because in a way it defined what my overview has become. So my own journey in terms of the health field began studying medicine in the UK. And as soon as I'd finished that, I felt that there was a lot missing. What I'd been taught about was good from a sort of material science point of view, but it didn't tell me enough about the rest of life. And I made a commitment to myself then to study other holistic modalities so that I could continue in the specialist training I was going through with the idea of ultimately having a vision of combining the two different paradigms. So that very early idea has continued to grow through my life, and I've been fortunate enough to train in lots of different modalities while still maintaining my medical background and my medical practice. And what that's meant is that the philosophy is to try and bring together for each person that I see enough options for them to be able to make the changes they need to make in order to move into a healthier state. And that may sound a bit vague, because I see a lot of people with very chronic, complex problems that often others have had trouble trying to sort out. And by having all these different possibilities in the background of what we could do together, it allows me to, for each person, to find specific ways that we can blend both the modern allopathic medical ideas, but also with many other different holistic ideas, in order that they can, as I say, move past any blocks to their health, but also ultimately try to look at how can I help them improve their well-being, their overall sense of enjoyment of life, if you like.
Thank you. And that prompts a number of questions. You said something about when you were training, having a sense of there being something more, something bigger to explore in this field of medicine and healing. And as you're exploring these other modalities with people beyond the more traditional medicines that many people will be more familiar with, where does that take you and them in their sense of this more holistic approach to life? So how do those conversations go? Does it stay entirely centered on the physical body? And what do we mean when we start to speak about that sort of more holistic, bigger sense of life when we're talking about healing?
No, it's all about languaging for me. And what I did miss out in that very short précis of how I came to be looking at crossing the different paradigms is that I also had an appetite for philosophy, and ultimately for esoteric traditions as well. And so I studied a lot of those through my 20s, 30s, and 40s. And those gave me some of the language that is very useful for going past the obvious physical to, if you like, the more energetic, or even about things like meaning and purpose, which ultimately can be behind what isn't working for the person, what is the cause of their ill health. So it's finding what suits each person in terms of the language that they are comfortable with. And part of the enjoyable part of the dance with working with people is actually finding how best to bridge that particular process in terms of what will they feel comfortable with, and how can we talk about other ways of seeing their situation that can bring about a deeper healing, a deeper understanding of what is actually happening for them.
No, and I can see that many of our listeners may well also have either touched into or be starting to explore some of the wider philosophies, be they from the esoteric world or other traditions in spirituality or religion, or even pure philosophy. And all of those pointers, I think, to something that is almost a continuous replication of a model. And the human body is a system, and we live in a system. And so we can perhaps see that the healing that is needed in each individual person, whatever we might be dealing with on the mental, physical, emotional, or even spiritual level, is then playing out in the wider sense. How, in the philosophies that you hold, how do you see that correspondence between the healing of the individual body and our, whatever ailments or challenges we may be facing, and what we see going on in the wider world?
I think what I love to bring up early on is the concept of the fact that we are holograms. And you've already mentioned some of the main concepts behind the hologram, that you can come into being with that person and working with them, say at the physical level, or at the emotional level, or at the mental level, or at the spiritual or social level. And each one of those levels can make a difference to the others. So each one holds part of the answer, if you like, or at least an avenue towards that answer. So it's working with that person to say, okay, you have, let's make up something like you have terrible migraines the whole time. Now, from a Western perspective, we would say that's to do with blood vessels dilating and causing pain, and there are drugs you can take. But from a bigger perspective, I'd be looking at what was behind all of that, what's been going on in that person's life, in that person's perhaps family life, social life, their work life, that is causing stressors to happen. And sometimes I'd go into a different paradigm, for instance, from the Eastern perspective. That could be to do with the energy flow, to do with things like liver and gallbladder, which may sound very peculiar to some, but from a Chinese or a traditional Chinese medicine point of view, we can look at other ways of that person sorting out what's going on, because that could be due to having ambition that's not working out, to do with a degree of depression or other things related to that process. So that's at that level. And then I think if I backtrack a moment, because when I start looking at the fundamental causes of health problems, what I see is usually that there are either certain chronic or acute toxicities. When I mean that toxicity, it could be literally a chemical toxin, but more likely some other form of toxin, including a psychological one, a sense of what's affecting the person. There can be infections, there can be other nutritional imbalances and so on. And part of my job is to try and work out what's going on for each person at those different levels. But we're also aware that, for instance, particularly with the last couple of years with the pandemic, there have been other stresses on people that have been much more at a community or even a national and probably even international level. So there are other stressors that come to play. And sometimes we need to talk about those to say, okay, what is really behind your presentation, what you come with?
And Tim, as you kind of consider individual situations and cases, if you will, or circumstances, you've mentioned there some of those stresses that can come from other levels, from the where the person is in their life, but also the outer influences and effects that we can have. We're seeing a lot of dis-ease, if you will, and ill health, on using that term in a more broad sense, across our world at this time. And people could be forgiven for heading into quite a lot of despair and despondency, and I imagine depression and other things could set in. So the inflow of some of those pressures could be quite huge, as you've mentioned. But I'm curious also about that interplay between how we as individuals can actually help have an effect on and are part of healing those bigger diseases. So, war and conflict and economic challenge and climate change and so on all seem like they're external to us. And yet it's somehow coming back to this interdependent system. There's something about healing at multiple levels. And I'm curious about, how do we take that more integrative approach and start really healing our planet?
Yeah, well, I think you bring up some great questions, and I think that we can come into it rather like this hologram idea at different levels to say, okay, what are we going to do? Is it that the person, for instance, I'm working with in front of me, that's affected by the anxiety and the fears that have become commonplace now, through particularly fear of infection, but also fear of global warming, fear of ecological disasters and so on, and fear of war. I think that sense of fear, which is a very primitive and very powerful emotion, is quite an impetus for causing dis-ease. People are no longer at ease with their lives because of all of these things going on. How do we deal with them? Well, I think there are levels again. This is the hologram. One level is ourselves. Each one of us, I think, has the duty to try and be as at peace as we can, in the sense of being in a space where we are not overly affected by all of these global emotions and disasters and so on going on. We can be aware of them, but it's how we are affected by them. So I think how we deal with ourselves in terms of our own sense of well-being, our own sense of peace and presence is very, very important. If we can work together in groups to help others in that process, I think that's very important. And that can be simple groups like in families or larger groups. And ultimately, we can look at things like political groups and so on. But I think even when we work to get ourselves into the best proper state, if you like, there is a ripple effect. There is this process of adding our little part to the whole synergy of what's going on, versus the opposite, which is amplifying the sense of fear and anxiety.
Yeah. Yes, and I think it can be so easy for us to imagine or think that we are powerless in the face of some of these huge situations that are going on around us, and that in a sense they are external to us, and that we don't have an impact. And yet our own individual healing and the healing that we can effect, as you say, through ourselves and through our families, it strikes me, and communities, whatever we're part of, it strikes me these are all part of the potential that exists for healing. So in a sense, not diminishing the power that we can have by taking responsibility for our own well-being, not just at not just at the obvious chronic level, but more broadly. You've worked in both, as you say, traditional and more holistic medicine. What's your sense as we look to the future about how this more integrative view of health and medicine and well-being, how will that develop? Because it strikes me that it's growing, but it still feels relatively niche in some respects. It's still not something that's widespread, certainly in the West. I'm wondering what your view is on what is it that will help to broaden that, the acceptance of more integrative medicine.
Yeah, it's one that I've thought about a lot, because I belong to various professional groups that look at this too. I think there are certain things that need to be both understood and worked with. One is, if, for instance, if we look at the way what you call tradition, but what is present day modern medicine or allopathy, what is that stance compared to the other holistic stances? Because the allopathic medicine has been the dominant one in the West for the last 100 or so years. So it's taken over healthcare by and large, whereas previously it wasn't there to do that. And in many other countries around the world and civilizations, that way of doing medicine isn't necessarily the main or the dominant one. So what I've been looking at is, okay, why is it difficult for these two different sets of modalities, in fact, or paradigms, because they're really a whole thought process. Why don't they get on well together? And I've tried an awful lot to help them get on, believe you me. And I think it's about language, it's about history, it's about how people tend to protect what they consider their own or what they consider to be their truth, rather than being willing to look outside and find the language to communicate well with the other paradigms. So I think there's a whole problem between, if I call it the languaging of it, how we understand each other, and also the willingness to some extent. So there's this background that needs to be worked with. Now, and are there easy ways through that? I don't think there are. We've looked at lots of different ways. But what I do see happening, which I think is more fundamental and very important, is that people are making their own choices about what they want in terms of their healthcare and how they want it delivered to them. And actually, the use of holistic, integrative and traditional medicine, even in Western world, is growing. And about 50 to 70% of the population will see someone who uses that form of medicine or healing within a year or so each year, if you see what I mean. It's a large part of what's being, of how people approach their health, even if it's simple things like probiotics and vitamins and so on. So I think and a lot of that, I think, comes down to the sense of being personally empowered to look after themselves, looking for things that are more natural and potentially less harmful. And so I think these choices that people are making are part of the most important aspect of how it grows from the ground up. Because if we're waiting for it to change from the top down, I think it's a very long wait. There's a phrase in medicine, I'm afraid, is that things change as the last generation dies off. It takes quite a while for change to happen. Whereas we need change much more quickly than that to be able to adapt to what's going on in society.
Yeah, no, I agree. And it's interesting that saying that you referred to in medicine, I think we can see in so many different parts of human endeavor. And certainly, I see it very much in the business world as well, that as much as one feels that the power comes from the top, but it's actually the containing force that comes from the top, and that the liberation force in many ways does come from the grassroots, and so making sure that we have information and understanding at that level, I think, is really key. As part of this series, Tim, we've been trying to put ourselves very much into the mindset of a new era of human evolution, and by that a sense of really revealing and living the true potential of humanity, going beyond some of our limitations, going beyond the things that maybe cause some of the pain and disease and distress that people are suffering from, and to kind of live more of our birthright. These are big words, of course, but and can evoke all sorts of different thoughts as to what that might mean. I wonder whether you're able to share anything of your vision when you think about healing and health in, well, when I use the word the future, I mean, I think it's even possible today, but let's just keep it in that sense of an imagining. What's your hope? What's your dream for how health and healing will be in the psyche of humanity as we move towards a better version of ourselves? What's the sort of conversations we'd be having? How would we be living health in this new era, in your imagination?
It's a good one, and I think I would be saying the best place to start is with children, and but it requires a huge change in emphasis of how we see, for instance, education, so that young people grow up with a much better understanding of how we are linked together, both as peoples and nations and the world generally, but also in terms of how our health is linked into very obvious things like the food we eat, and how can we actually grow and make better food that's more nutritionally of benefit, and the reasons for doing that, so it becomes the normal to want to have those kind of foods that will actually nourish the person and prevent disease. We know that somewhere between 50 and 70% of cancers are preventable through the correct diet if we started early enough. I mean, that's a massive figure, okay? So I think that has to start, as I say, very early. So it needs to be an educational thing, but it's not simply about nutrition. It's about lifestyle, and it's also about our health in our emotional and our mental and our spiritual health. And again, I think that also has to start very early on in life, so that we start producing new generations of people who are very much aware of how to get their own bodies, mind, spirit into harmony through the right way of living, the right way of being, versus the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff, which is what we've been doing for the last 100 or 200 years, if not a lot longer. We need to start very, very early on to make that happen. And that's going to take enormous amount of change at all levels, whether it's political, economic, whether it's just the philosophy of what we know, because it means a vast change. And I don't see it changing overnight. I see this as a gradual thing. But I tell you what, I am very pleased to be seeing quite a lot of young people, and I'm meaning a kind of mid-teens through to the 30s and so on, who are becoming very much more aware of how they impact themselves and how their surroundings are impacting both them and how they impact the surroundings. So there is this degree of consciousness, I think, that is growing. And that's a bit about what I'm talking about, because it's finding the generation who is willing to make these changes happen in the next younger generation. Because until we get through these cycles of evolution, you know, like I was saying, you've got to wait till the last generation dies almost. I think it's going to be difficult to make those changes, which are ultimately about what health is. Health is about being our fully integrated selves at all levels. And to me, it's about that. It's a very big picture of health. It's a health at if you like, an esoteric level as well.
No, and I think that generational point certainly strikes a chord with me, in the sense that the more we can empower the younger people to ask questions, to see things in a different way, to have a different relationship with themselves and with the planet. And we do see that happening in a lot of ways, that certainly the young people that I come into contact with seem to have a lot more understanding of the at least their local environment and the interplay between that and themselves, and their ability to be part of influencing what goes on in their environment in many ways. So that there's a different power relationship in some ways there for me that I'm witnessing.
I might add one other thing, if I could. You just reminded me, as you were saying, what I've been seeing in the last few months, last 6 to 12 months anyway, is a growing number of young doctors, certainly here in New Zealand, but I know in other parts of the world, who are quitting medicine because they no longer can cope with the paradigm they're working under. They cannot deal with the materialistic, drug-orientated, corporate-controlled process any longer. And a number of those who have actually quit already, they're otherwise very good doctors, are looking at other ways that they can help healing happen without having to have a medical degree to rely on. But they've got all the training to use, which is wonderful. And I am very impressed, and in fact, I've got a webinar with one tomorrow night, about the new ideas they're coming up with, using modern media, social media, and so on, to get messages across so that people can be empowered into their own health and changes for a better well-being.
Wonderful, wonderful. That's very, very encouraging. Tim, we're coming to the end of our time, and when we have a guest on in these podcasts, we like to close with a request from our guest, and that is to ask you if there's a seed thought or a sentence, something that you can leave our listeners with that would help them to have a practical level of daily reflection on their own health and well-being. Is there something, and I accept it's a vast subject, but something that you feel might be useful to our listeners to help them maybe even reposition their own mindset around health and well-being?
This is both very difficult and at the other end quite simple in a way. My sense is in almost one sentence. I'll try and make it one sentence. Let's see. My wish is that all humanity, all of us, learn to fully love ourselves, as ultimately that is the essence of healing. So learning to fully love ourselves, and that also means letting go of anything that's in the way of that happening.
What a beautiful way to end our session here today. Thank you, Tim. That's I'm sure people will be able to reflect on that, and I hope be able to embrace it fully as we all continue to strive for full health and full well-being, not only for ourselves but for the planet and for all of humanity. So, Tim, thank you. I know we've only scratched the surface of a very big subject, but we really appreciate your time and your wisdom here today. Thank you for being part of our series.
Thank you, Lorraine. It's been a pleasure.
For now, goodbye.
Bye for now.
This podcast was offered by the Community of Living Ethics, Umbria, Italy, and freely inspired by Aldebaran, the community's Astrosophy group, and by our research on service.